The call came in at 1:43 a.m. A man calmly reported someone standing in the middle of the road. When officers arrived, there was no one there. No footprints, no witnesses, and when I checked the system, the call had never been logged. I never planned on staying in Valentine, Nebraska, longer than a single night, and that fact mattered to me more than it probably should have. I was driving west after leaving a job I'd spent nearly a decade convincing myself I didn't hate, telling people I needed space when the truth was simpler. I needed distance from a life that had started to feel pre-written and hollow. Valentine wasn't on my list of destinations. But exhaustion makes decisions for you when you stop listening to your own better judgment. And by the time I saw the flickering sign for a gas station just off Highway 20, the sky was already deep into that unnaturally dark shade that only appears in places far from city light. The town itself felt smaller than I expected, quieter than it should have been. The kind of place where sound seems to get absorbed by the open land instead of echoing back. The gas station was the only thing still awake, its fluorescent lights buzzing faintly. And I remember thinking, before I even stepped out of the car, that the silence felt deliberate, like the town was holding its breath. Inside, the clerk barely looked up when I walked in, a woman in her late 30s, with tired eyes and a polite smile that didn't quite reach them. We exchanged the kind of small talk people make when neither party intends to remember the conversation. And I was halfway to the cooler when I noticed him standing outside the front windows. He wasn't doing anything unusual, at least not at first glance. He was just standing there, hands at his sides, facing the glass as if he were looking in. But something about the way he stood made my skin tighten. He was too still, not stiff, not tense, just unmoving, as if he'd been placed there and forgotten. I glanced back at the clerk, expecting some reaction, but she was focused on the register, tapping keys slowly, deliberately. When I looked back, the man was still there. He didn't knock. He didn't wave. He didn't even shift his weight. I told myself it was nothing, that late-night fatigue had a way of exaggerating harmless details. But as I paid and walked toward the door, I realized he wasn't reflected in the glass the way he should have been. The interior lights cast clear reflections of the shelves, the counter, even my own shape as I approached. But where the man stood, there was only darkness, as if the glass refused to acknowledge him. I stopped short, heart giving an uncomfortable jolt, and opened the door. The bell chimed, sharp in the quiet, and for the first time, he moved, not away, toward me, close enough that I could see his face clearly, or at least I should have been able to. His features were wrong, not deformed, not monstrous, just indistinct, like a face remembered from a dream rather than seen with your eyes. His eyes were there, I think, but they didn't seem to focus on me. They looked past me, or through me, and when he spoke, his voice was calm, almost gentle. "You're not from here," he said, not as a question. I agreed, forcing a casual tone I didn't feel, and asked if he needed help. For a long moment, he didn't answer. Then he tilted his head slightly and said, "I thought you might know the way." The sentence felt incomplete, like he'd stopped speaking halfway through a thought. But before I could ask what he meant, the clerk called out from behind the counter, her voice suddenly tight. "Sir," she said, not to me, but to him, "you need to leave." The man didn't react. He didn't even acknowledge her presence. She repeated herself, louder this time. And when he finally turned his head, the movement was slow, reluctant, like he was being pulled away from something important. He stepped back without a word, retreating into the darkness beyond the lights. And I stood there far longer than I should have, watching the empty space where he'd been, waiting for him to reappear. He didn't. The clerk didn't say anything else, and neither did I. But as I left and drove away, I checked my rearview mirror more times than I could justify, half expecting to see him standing in the road behind me, unchanged, unmoving. I spent the night at a small motel on the edge of town, the kind with thin walls and a humming ice machine outside every room, and I told myself that what I'd experienced was nothing more than a strange encounter with a local eccentric, amplified by stress and exhaustion. That explanation held, barely, until around 2:17 a.m. when I woke to the sound of footsteps outside my door. They weren't heavy. They weren't rushed. They were measured, deliberate, stopping directly in front of my room. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, listening, waiting for a knock that never came. After a full minute, the footsteps moved on, receding down the walkway until they disappeared entirely. I didn't sleep again. The next morning, over weak coffee in the motel lobby, I asked the desk attendant if there was anyone in town known for wandering around at night. She looked at me for a long moment before shaking her head. "Not anymore," she said. And when I asked what she meant, she smiled politely and changed the subject. I should have left then. That was my instinct, the sensible choice. But something about the encounter had lodged itself under my skin, a quiet unease mixed with curiosity. And instead of getting back on the highway, I drove back into town. Valentine was small enough that it didn't take long to get a feel for it. People were friendly but reserved, conversations polite and surface level, as if everyone had agreed, without ever saying so, to avoid certain topics. When I mentioned the man at the gas station to a local bartender that afternoon, his expression tightened almost imperceptibly before he laughed it off. "Probably just passing through," he said. "Happens more than you'd think." But later, when he thought I wasn't looking, I saw him glance toward the door, then toward the windows, like he was checking for something. That night, I parked across from the gas station just before closing, telling myself I only wanted confirmation that I hadn't imagined the whole thing. The clerk was different this time, a younger guy with earbuds hanging around his neck. And for a while, nothing happened. Then, just as the clock ticked over to midnight, the man appeared again, standing in the same spot, facing the glass, perfectly still. This time, I stayed in the car, watching. Minutes passed. The clerk didn't notice him. Cars drove by without slowing. It was as if the man existed slightly out of sync with the rest of the world, visible only when he chose to be. I felt a cold pressure settle in my chest, a growing certainty that whatever this was, it wasn't meant to be understood easily. When the station lights shut off and the clerk locked up, the man didn't move. He remained there, alone in the dark, until the clerk drove away. And then, slowly, deliberately, he turned his head and looked directly at me. I don't know how he knew I was there. I don't know how he could see through the windshield, through the shadows. But I felt the moment our attention connected like a physical thing. He raised one hand, not in a wave, but in something closer to acknowledgement. And then he stepped back, disappearing once more into the night. I drove away shaking. My earlier curiosity replaced by something colder and heavier. Over the next 2 days, I learned things without meaning to. Snippets of conversation, half-finished sentences, local legends dismissed with nervous laughter. A man seen standing outside homes late at night, never knocking, never entering. Footprints found in frost or mud that led nowhere. Reports made and quietly forgotten. And always the same detail. No one could remember seeing him arrive, only that he was suddenly there. The oldest story dated back decades, further than I expected. And when I visited the small local historical society, I found a single mention buried in an old newspaper clipping, yellowed and fragile. A man had been found dead on the outskirts of town in the early 1950s. No identification, no record of where he came from. The article ended with a line that chilled me more than anything else I'd read. Authorities note that no one recalls seeing the man before that night. That evening, as I packed my car, determined to leave before darkness fell, I found wet footprints leading from the edge of the parking lot to the door of my motel room. They were fresh, perfectly formed, and they stopped inches from the threshold. I didn't wait to see if there would be more. I got in my car and drove, the town shrinking behind me, the open road stretching out ahead, and I told myself, over and over, that distance would dull the memory, that whatever haunted Valentine belonged there and nowhere else. For a while, that was true. Weeks passed, then months. I took a new job in another state, settled into a different routine, and almost convinced myself the whole experience had been a stress-induced hallucination. Almost. Because sometimes, late at night, when I stop at a gas station in a town I don't recognize, I catch myself looking at the windows, checking the darkness just beyond the lights. And once, just once, I thought I saw a figure standing there, too still to be real, waiting for someone who might finally know the way. I moved to Ashland, Oregon, because I wanted quiet. And more than that, I wanted anonymity. The kind that lets you exist without anyone asking why you left or what you're running from. And Ashland felt like the perfect place for that, with its tree-lined streets, sleepy neighborhoods, and the illusion of calm that comes from being tucked between mountains where nothing ever seems urgent. I rented a small house on Clay Street, in a neighborhood so quiet that the loudest sound most nights was the wind brushing through leaves or a distant train horn that never felt close enough to matter. And for the first few weeks, everything was exactly what I needed. I worked remotely, kept to myself, and spent my evenings sitting on the porch with a drink, watching the streetlights flick on one by one as dusk settled in. That was when I first noticed the porch light. It belonged to a house across the street, 2 doors down, a modest single-story place with pale siding and a narrow front porch, and the light was always on. Not just late, not just occasionally, but every single night, without exception. At first, it barely registered as anything more than a background detail, the kind of thing your brain catalogs without comment. But after a while, the consistency began to itch at me. The light never flickered, never dimmed, never turned off, even during the day, when the sun was bright enough to wash out everything else. It was just on. I asked myself the normal questions, the rational ones. Maybe the owner worked nights. Maybe they were forgetful. Maybe it was a motion light stuck in some permanent loop. But there was something about it that felt deliberate. And that feeling grew stronger the longer I lived there. I realized, slowly, that I had never seen anyone come or go from that house. No car in the driveway, no packages on the porch, no movement behind the curtains, just the light. One evening, while chatting with my neighbor Mark, a retired teacher who lived next door and seemed to know everyone on the block, I casually mentioned it, keeping my tone light. "Do you know who lives in that house with the porch light always on?" He followed my gaze, squinted slightly, and for just a moment, his smile faltered. "That one?" he said, then laughed a little too quickly. "It's been empty for a while." I waited for him to elaborate, but he didn't. When I pressed, he shrugged. "Someone must have left the light on before they moved out. Happens." It didn't happen like that, not for weeks on end. Not without anyone noticing. But I let it go, telling myself I was reading into nothing. The thing is, once you notice something like that, you can't unsee it. And soon I found myself checking the light without meaning to, measuring my evenings by its steady glow. Then it started turning on earlier. At first, it was subtle, just a few minutes before sunset. But over time, the gap widened, until I realized the light was already on, while the sky was still pale, while birds were still calling, and people were still out walking dogs. One afternoon, I stood at my window watching it, a low unease settling in my chest, and I noticed something else that made my stomach tighten. There was no power line running to the porch, no visible conduit, nothing that explained how the light was even on. I crossed the street that evening, telling myself I was being ridiculous, that I just wanted a closer look. And as I stood at the edge of the property, the air felt wrong, heavier somehow, like the space around the house resisted being occupied. The porch boards were dusty, undisturbed. And when I reached out to touch the light fixture, it was cold. Not warm, not even slightly heated the way an active bulb should be. Just cold metal, humming faintly, a vibration I felt more than heard. I stepped back, my pulse racing. And that night, I dreamed of standing in my own living room, looking out the window at that same light. Only in the dream, it was coming from my porch instead. I woke up just before dawn, heart pounding, and for a brief, disorienting moment, I couldn't tell which house I was in. The dreams didn't stop. They shifted, changed, grew more specific. I dreamed of walking toward the light, of standing beneath it and realizing it wasn't casting shadows correctly, of feeling watched without ever seeing who or what was watching. During the day, I started noticing other things. People avoided looking at the house. Conversations stalled when it came up. Once, I overheard two women at a cafe whispering about the light, their voices dropping as if the word itself carried weight. And when I tried to join the conversation, they fell silent and changed the subject. That was when curiosity tipped into obsession. I began documenting it, filming short clips from my phone at different times of day, noting when the light came on, how it never went off, how it seemed almost brighter on nights when the rest of the street felt darker. I showed the footage to Mark, hoping for validation, but he barely glanced at it before handing my phone back. "You should let it go," he said, his voice low, serious in a way I hadn't heard before. "Some things don't need attention." The warning felt less like advice and more like fear. A week later, there was a power outage. A storm rolled through, knocking out electricity across the neighborhood, plunging the street into darkness. And as I stood at my window, watching the sudden absence of light, my gaze snapped to that house. The porch light was still on, brighter than ever, a lone beacon in the black. and something inside me broke. I grabbed my jacket and stepped outside, driven by a need I couldn't articulate. Crossing the street as rain began to fall. The closer I got, the quieter everything became, the sound of the storm fading, until all I could hear was my own breathing and the faint hum of that light. The front door was unlocked. I didn't remember deciding to open it. Only the sensation of my hand on the knob, the way it turned easily, invitingly. Inside, the house was empty, stripped down to bare essentials, no furniture, no decorations, just clean walls and a single hallway leading deeper inside. The air smelled stale, untouched, like a place sealed off from time. At the end of the hallway was a room with a window facing the street, and in that room, directly beneath the porch light, was a chair. Just one. As I stood there, frozen, the light outside flickered for the first time since I'd known it. And in the glass of the window, I saw my own reflection sitting in the chair, staring back at me. Eyes hollow, expression blank. I stumbled back, heart hammering, and the reflection didn't move. I ran. I don't remember locking the door. I don't remember crossing the street. I only remember slamming into my own house and collapsing against the wall, gasping for air. The next morning, the house across the street looked normal, empty. The porch light was gone. No fixture, no wiring, nothing. I told myself it was over, that whatever had been there had finally ended, and for a while, I believed it. Weeks passed. The dreams stopped. The unease faded. I began to feel foolish, embarrassed by my own fixation. Then, one evening, as the sun dipped toward the horizon, I noticed a familiar glow in my peripheral vision. My porch light had turned on by itself. I took the night dispatcher job in Marfa, Texas, because it was quiet, and because quiet felt safer after everything that had gone wrong in my life. And when I say quiet, I don't just mean low crime or slow calls. I mean the kind of silence that stretches out across desert roads, where sound dies before it reaches anything else. The kind that makes you feel like the world has paused and forgotten you exist. Marfa is small, isolated, and surrounded by miles of open land that looks empty until you spend enough nights staring into it, and then you realize how much darkness can hide when there's nothing around to define its shape. The police station reflected that same emptiness, especially after midnight, when I was usually the only one awake, sitting behind a desk with a radio, a phone, and a glowing monitor that tracked calls and units in real time. I liked the routine at first. Calls were rare, mostly noise complaints, the occasional stranded driver. Nothing urgent, nothing that required too much thought. That suited me. I wasn't looking to make a difference. I just wanted to get through my shifts without feeling anything too strongly. The first call came in at 1:43 a.m. on a Tuesday, and it didn't sound strange at all at first. The line connected cleanly, no static, no distortion. Just a man's voice, calm and controlled, telling me there was someone standing in the middle of Route 90 just outside town. He said it plainly, like he was reporting a broken traffic light or debris in the road. I asked for details, and he gave them without hesitation. Mile marker, direction of travel, even a description. A person standing still, not waving, not trying to flag anyone down, just standing there. Something about the way he spoke bothered me, not because he sounded scared, but because he didn't sound concerned at all. I logged the call, dispatched a unit, and waited. 10 minutes later, the officer radioed back. Nothing there. Empty road, no footprints, no signs of anyone having been there at all. I chalked it up to a prank or a mistake, closed the call, and moved on. Except when I checked the system later, the call wasn't there. No record, no timestamp, no audio. I assumed it was a glitch, made a mental note to mention it to IT, and tried not to think about how clearly I remembered the man's voice. The second call came 2 nights later, almost exactly the same time. Same voice, same calm tone. This time, the location was closer, just outside the eastern edge of town. "They're still standing there," he said, and the wording made my stomach tighten. I asked who they were, and after a brief pause, he corrected himself. "Someone," he said, "someone is standing in the road." Again, I dispatched a unit. Again, nothing. And again, when I went back to the logs, there was no record of the call ever happening. I started writing things down in a notebook after that, my own unofficial log, because I didn't trust the system anymore. And more than that, I didn't trust my own memory. The calls continued. Always late. Always calm. Always reporting someone standing in the road. Never asking for help. Never staying on the line longer than necessary. Each time, the location crept closer to town. Mile by mile. Intersection by intersection. Like whatever was being reported was slowly approaching. I asked one of the officers about it during a slow shift, keeping my tone casual, and he laughed it off. Said desert towns attract weird calls, people seeing things in the dark, shadows playing tricks on tired eyes. But when I mentioned that the calls weren't logging, his smile faded. "You sure about that?" he asked, and when I nodded, he told me, quietly, that a dispatcher before me had complained about something similar years ago. He couldn't remember the details, just that it had freaked her out. She'd quit without notice not long after. I should have stopped answering the calls. That seems obvious now. But when the phone rings, you answer it. That's the job. The 5th call came with a change. When I asked for the caller's name, he gave it. It was my name. I felt the blood drain from my face as he repeated it correctly, without hesitation. When I demanded to know how he knew that, there was a pause, longer than before. And then he said, "You told me." The line went dead before I could respond. That night, when I drove home, I took a different route than usual, avoiding the roads he'd mentioned, my headlights cutting through the dark as I tried not to imagine someone standing just beyond their reach. I started sleeping with the lights on. I started jumping every time the phone rang at work, even when it was a normal call. The 6th call came during a storm, thunder rolling over the desert, rain hitting the roof hard enough to drown out the radio. The voice sounded closer somehow, clearer, like he was speaking from just outside the building. "I'm almost there," he said. I didn't ask where. I didn't have to. I checked the system while he was still on the line, watching as nothing appeared. No incoming call, no alert, nothing to prove it was happening at all. My hands were shaking when I hung up. The officers found nothing again. They always did. But the next morning, there were footprints on Route 90, leading from the shoulder of the road toward town, stopping abruptly in the middle of the asphalt, as if whoever made them had simply vanished. They didn't match any known shoe pattern. The final call came on a night, so quiet it felt unreal. No wind, no traffic, just the hum of the building and the glow of the monitors. When the phone rang, I didn't answer right away. I stared at it, knowing exactly who it would be, knowing that once I picked up, something would change. When I finally did, he didn't bother with the script. "I'm already here," he said. I asked him where he was, my voice barely steady, and for the first time, he sounded almost amused. "You'll see," he said. The line disconnected. I checked the cameras. All clear. The doors were locked. The radio was silent. And then I heard footsteps in the hallway behind me. Slow, deliberate, stopping just out of sight. I didn't turn around. I logged the call in my notebook with shaking hands, knowing it wouldn't appear anywhere else, knowing that no one would ever see it but me. When the morning shift arrived, they found my desk empty, my badge neatly placed beside the phone, and my notebook open to the last entry. No one ever found me. Officially, there was no record of a call that night. Unofficially, if you ask around Marfa long enough, someone will tell you that sometimes, late at night, the dispatcher phone rings with no incoming signal, and when it does, no one is ever quite sure who's already there.